Overspeed.
This video will include references to historical heavy loss of life, so if you are a sensitive viewer, please be advised. It's the 3rd of March 1974. Turkish Airlines Flight 981, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, is climbing away from Paris Orly Airport. As the aircraft climbs through about 12,000 feet, a sudden explosive decompression occurs as the aft cargo door rips off the aircraft. Now, if you think that this sounds familiar, it's because it is. Less than 2 years earlier, the crew of American Airlines Flight 96 had defied all odds and managed to land their stricken aircraft after a very similar incident. This time though, the outcome is far more terrifying. So what has actually happened this time? Are there parallels to the previous accident, and if so, how is that possible? As always, we will find the answer to that in the final report, so please stay tuned. It's impossible to tell you the story about Turkish Airlines Flight 981 without first explaining American Airlines Flight 96. Okay, these incidents are very similar, and I did a video about American Airlines before you watch this video. In summary, American Airlines Flight 96 was also flown by a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, and when the crew departed Detroit and climbed through roughly 11,700 feet, its aft cargo door ripped off the aircraft, causing an explosive decompression, and because of a lack of ventilation between the passenger cabin and the cargo hold, part of the aft cabin floor collapsed in towards the missing door, severely damaging the control cables to the horizontal stabilizer, to the elevators, rudder, and the number 2 engine. Now, through a combination of skill of both the flight crew and the cabin crew, this aircraft managed after some severe difficulties to get down safely on the ground, and everyone survived. But in the case of Turkish Airlines Flight 981, it was to become the biggest single aviation accident in terms of human lives lost at its time. So what are the differences between the two? Well, first of all, we have to look at what happened in the almost 2 years that separated the two accidents. American Airlines Flight 96 happened back in June 1972, and in February 1973, the National Transportation Safety Board came with their final report. In the final report, they had some quite severe remarks on the design of the McDonnell Douglas DC-10. It stated that the locking mechanism of the aft cargo door needed to get reinforcement, specifically to the torque tube that connected the handle to the vent door, in order to make sure that it couldn't be bent, thereby making sure that the door handle could not be closed if the locks was not in the correct position. In addition to that, there needed to be some kind of verification procedure so that the person who was operating the door could verify that the locks had gone completely into position. And also there needed to be increased ventilation in between the cargo holds and the passenger holds because of the position of the control cables in the flooring between the two compartments. The rapid depressurization was not to be allowed to damage these critical control functions. As soon as the Federal Aviation Administration got a hold of this final report, they started to work on something called an AD. Right? That's an airworthiness directive. And an airworthiness directive is the big hammer in aviation legislation. Okay? If an airworthiness directive is issued, well then anyone who's flying the type of aircraft that is covered by the AD needs to essentially put it down on the ground and sort out whatever the issues are before they're allowed to continue to fly with it. That's going to come with some really big costs for any airline who's flying that type, who's covered by the AD, and it's going to be a huge embarrassment for the aircraft manufacturer. And it might be because of that the director of the Douglas department in McDonnell Douglas came into contact with the FAA administrator, and the both men sat down and came to what has been known as a gentleman's agreement. And in the gentleman's agreement, the FAA promised not to issue an airworthiness directive, and in return McDonnell Douglas would make sure that any of the issues that was raised in the final report would be sorted through something called service bulletins with alert status. Now, service bulletin is a less powerful tool than an AD. While an AD would force anyone to, sort the problems out immediately, a service bulletin will give a little bit of leeway, a little bit of time for any airlines to implement the corrections needed. They are still powerful, right? Especially if it comes with alert status, which indicates that this has safety implication. Any airline who doesn't comply with the safety bulletin would open themselves up to potential litigation in case something happened, but it's not the big hammer. Very quickly after this, McDonnell Douglas did issue 3 separate service bulletins for the DC-10. The first one instructed airlines to put in a kind of support bracket to hold the torque tube connected to the handle, and because of that support tube it would be impossible to bend the tube, and thus in theory making it impossible to close the door handle if the locks were not in the proper position. The second one was an instruction to create about an inch big viewing hole in the door, so that anyone operating the door could look through that viewing hole and see physically that the locks had gotten into the correct position. The third service bulletin was to provide better electrical wiring to the electrical motor that was driving the locking mechanism to make sure that it wouldn't stop prematurely. When it came to the part of the special report that mentioned the increased ventilation between the passenger cabin and the cargo compartment, McDonnell Douglas hadn't found a proper solution to that yet, so there was no service bulletin issued on that matter at this time. The aircraft that was later going to become Turkish Airlines Flight 981, Ship 29, was delivered to Turkish Airlines with paperwork stating that all 3 of these service bulletins had been properly implemented. Now, in the subsequent investigations, it was going to come to light that only one of them
Presenting an American dream. For years, American Airlines has dreamed of having a quiet plane with virtually smokeless engines, as comfortable as a 747 but able to land at almost any commercial airport. Introducing the new DC-10 luxury liner.
It was going to come to light that only one of them actually had been completed, but we'll talk about that in a while. Turkish Airlines Flight 981 was scheduled as a two-leg flight starting in Istanbul and then about a 4-hour flight over towards Paris Orly Airport and then a very short last leg over towards London Heathrow. On the first leg there was 167 passengers and 11 crew. The captain of the flight was called Nejat Berköş, is 44 years old, has 7,000 hours in total, of which 438 hours was on type at the day of the accident. Together with him was First Officer Oral Ulusman, 38 years old, 5,589 hours and 628 hours on type. The flight engineer is called Erhan Öçer, 37 years old, 2,113 hours and 775 hours on type. There were 8 flight attendants from both the UK, France and Turkey on board. The first flight was completely uneventful. It left Istanbul at 7:57 local time and landed about 4 hours later at 11:02 in Paris Orly local time. Now when they arrived to Paris, 50 of the passengers disembarked the aircraft and they boarded another 216 passengers. This was quite unusual because normally this second leg was a little bit underbooked. But because of some strike action happening, passengers from both Air France and British Airways had been rebooked onto this Turkish Airlines flight to bring them over to London. The turnaround was initially supposed to be only 1 hour, but because of all of these extra passengers that was getting onto the aircraft, they delayed the flight for another 30 minutes. And while they were doing the turnaround, the aft cargo hold was completely emptied from cargo. And there was no new cargo going into that compartment, so it was closed. There were 3 people working with emptying the aft cargo compartment, and the person closing the door reported afterwards that he had no problems whatsoever closing the door. There was no extra force needed to put the handle into place. And he also said that he hadn't checked the little verification window that had been installed. The reason for that was that no one had actually instructed him on why he should be doing it. He didn't know what to look for. He had only seen other people do it. Now, next to the door handle, after American Airlines Flight 96, there had been installed some notes instructing the people closing the door on how important it was to verify that this lock was actually in place. Unfortunately though, that note was written in Turkish and in English, and the person who was closing the door only spoke French, so he never saw or understood the significance of this note. At time 12:24 local time, Turkish Airlines Flight 981 received their pushback clearance and taxi clearance out to holding position for runway 08 in Orly. During the taxi out, everything seems to be normal. The cockpit voice recorder is not indicating anything out of the ordinary. And at time 12:29, the aircraft started its takeoff roll. Initially, the clearance was to climb to 4,000 feet and then contact the departure controller. The weather in the area was perfectly fine, light winds from 060 degrees and only some few cumulus clouds around. The departure was completely normal. The aircraft climbed up to 4,000 feet, switched over to the departure controller, and the new controller instructed the aircraft to continue the climb to flight level 230, which is 23,000 feet, and turn left to a VOR navigational aid called Montidier, Mike Tango Delta. The aircraft completes its turn towards Montidier. It rolls out on a heading of 350 degrees, which is roughly a northerly heading, and continues its climb as instructed. But as the aircraft climbs through about 11,500 feet, a sudden decompression can be heard on the cockpit voice recorder, and it's also indicated on the flight data recorder. The first officer is heard to call out, "The aircraft has burst." And then a complete pandemonium starts. Okay, the flight data recorder indicates that the aircraft is pushed into a left-hand yaw as the rudder is deflected towards the left. The elevator is pitched down 3 degrees. Okay, this puts the aircraft nose into a diving position, and at the same time, the number 2 engine starts to fail. Very similar to what happened in American Airlines Flight 96. In the Air Traffic Control Center in Paris, the air traffic controllers can hear a transmission which is believed to come from Turkish Airlines Flight 981. The reason that they're not sure is because that the person that is holding the transmission button in the aircraft is not actually communicating with air traffic control. They can hear voices in Turkish that is talking about the severity of the problem that they're facing. They can also hear the cabin altitude alarm in the background, as well as the overspeed alarm. And this transmission goes on for several seconds. There will also be following 2 more transitions in the coming 70 seconds, which is left of this flight. At the same time, the controllers are looking at both their primary and their secondary radar. The secondary radar is the one that gets information from the aircraft transponder, and around about when the first transmission is coming from the aircraft, the code of the aircraft disappears from the secondary radar. But on the primary radar, the controllers can still see what now appears to be 2 different radar echoes. So the first one is representative of the aircraft, which continues up in a northerly direction, turning slightly toward the left. But the secondary echo stays approximately at the same place and remains for about a minute or 2 before it disappears from the screen. Subsequent investigations will show that as the aft cargo door once again opened in flight and got ripped off the aircraft, this time the passenger cabin floor in the back part of the aircraft collapsed in a much more catastrophic way, and 2 rows of passengers actually got pushed out through the open cargo compartment. And it is likely that that secondary radar echo that the air traffic controller saw was actually this happening. And the aircraft finds itself in a dive almost 20 degrees nose down, and that is a horrific attitude. Okay, as this is happening, the aircraft speed is increasing to 360, 400, and subsequently 430 knots. As the speed is increasing, the way aircrafts are built is that if they don't have any kind of control inputs, the stability of the aircraft will return the nose into an almost level position. And this is what seems to have happened on this flight as well. The nose subsequently increases from a minus 20 degrees pitch to about a minus 4 degrees pitch. The speed stabilizes around 430 knots, but even though the pilot seems to have control of their ailerons, there is no control in pitch in this case. So the aircraft will actually continue to fly for another approximately 15 kilometers before it impacts the forest of Ermenonville, which is about 37 kilometers northeast of Paris. The aircraft initially makes contacts with the tops of the trees in a about 4-degree descending angle and a slight left-hand turn, and subsequently it slams into the ground with almost 800 kilometers per hour. Because of that speed and the force of the impact, the aircraft is shattered into thousands of small fragments, and there's no fire breaking out just because of the sheer force of the impact. Obviously, this is a non-survivable event, and all 346 people on board are killed instantly, making this the most deadly aviation disaster at that time. Now the investigation kicks in, and among the debris field they manage to find both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder, which greatly helps the investigation. Also, in a field about 15 kilometers earlier, just under where the initial incident happened, they find the bodies of 6 passengers still strapped to their seats and what's left of the aft cargo door. And when they're starting to look into the cargo door, they immediately recognize the similarities with the accident 2 years earlier of American Airlines Flight 96. Because as they're looking into the lock mechanism, they see once again that the 4 main locks are not properly engaged. They have partially engaged, but they haven't achieved the over-center position, which makes the whole locking mechanism irreversible. But how is that possible? There was 3 separate service bulletins that were in force in order to stop precisely this from happening. Well, as the investigators continued to look into the door, they realized that even though the aircraft has been certified, as all of these 3 safety bulletins have been completed, they haven't been. In fact, the support bracket that is supposed to hold the upper torque tube and support it to make sure that it cannot be bent has not been installed at all. There is some indication that work has begun on the door, but it has never been completed. And when they continue looking down onto the locking mechanism, they look at the locking pins. The way that the locking pins are supposed to work is that as long as the locks are not completely in position, the locking pins are hidden behind a couple of metal flanges. So if you try to close the door handle with the locking pins behind those, the flanges will basically stop the mechanism from moving and making it impossible to close the door. But on the accident aircraft, it looks like these locking pins have been manually adjusted, and they're now about 8 millimeters shorter than they should be. And what that means is that as the door handle is being closed, the locking pin does come into contact with the backside of the metal flange, but there is a very little margin, and that margin can be overcome by the whole mechanism bending. And because the support bracket has not been installed, that torque tube once again is allowed to bend, making it easy to close the door. Only about 50 pounds would be needed in order to close the door. And this lines up with the ground handling agent, who said that he didn't feel that he needed to use any excessive force more than what he was used to close the door handle. Another adjustment that is found is that the lock indication mechanism that is supposed to send a signal up to the cockpit indicating when the doors are properly locked has also been adjusted. So in the position that it's found, the door locked light would have gone out before the lock comes into its properly closed position. Now, the ground handling agent would have been able to stop this sequence of events if he had been properly trained to actually check that the locking mechanism had engaged properly. But he hadn't been trained, and in fact on a regular basis it would be the ground engineer of Turkish Airlines who should be doing the walk around and verify that these locks were in place, but he was not on duty on that day. So as you can see, guys, as is the case with so many of these accidents, if any one of these factors would not been in place, it would have stopped the sequence of events that led up to the disaster. If the ground service agent had checked through the viewing hall and verified that the locks were in place, he would have seen that they weren't, and it would have stopped it. If any one of the service bulletins that were implemented in order to keep this from happening would have been properly implemented, it wouldn't have happened either. But because that wasn't the case, the aircraft proceeded with taking off with the locks not properly engaged, and as the differential pressure inside of the cargo hold started to rise, so did the pressure on the cargo door. If the cargo door would have been properly locked, that pressure would have been routed on towards the stops, which it was designed to do, and nothing would happen. But because the locks were not properly engaged, all of this force was now transferred onto the bolts that held the mechanism in place. And when the force became strong enough, it sheared off those bolts, opening the door and enabling the disaster. And this happened at around 12,000 feet, which was almost exactly the same altitude as it happened on American Airlines Flight 96. But why did this DC-10 end up in such a huge disaster when the American Airlines Flight 96 managed to land the aircraft safely? Well, the answer to this likely lies in the load of the aircraft, because the American Airlines Flight 96 only had about 56 passengers on board, and in the aft part of the cabin they had a lounge area and a small bar. But the Turkish Airlines Flight 981 was a completely full aircraft. right? It was 346 people on board, which meant that as the cargo door opened and the depressurization happened, there still wasn't enough venting, leaving the air from the passenger cabin anywhere to go in order to equalize the pressure difference between the cargo hold and the passenger cabin. This put an enormous amount of pressure onto the floor, a pressure that the aircraft was not designed to take. And because of the extra load, with all of the passengers sitting on top of the floor, it is likely that the floor at the back of that DC-10 completely collapsed, severing all of the control cables to the elevator, to the stabilizer, to the rudder, and to the engine number 2. If all of those cables were severed, it would have left the aircraft completely without any control in pitch. While in the American Airlines Flight 96, the floor only partially collapsed, enabling the aircrew to still have some control of their aircraft. This is likely the reason for the difference in outcome between the two accidents. In the aftermath to this horrible disaster, there were several large lawsuits filed, and during the discovery in those lawsuits, there were papers found from an employee at Convair, one of the subcontractors to McDonnell Douglas. His name was Dan Applegate. Now, Dan Applegate had, in the wake of American Airlines Flight 96, issued a memo to his bosses where he said that he was concerned about the degradation of the safety around the aft cargo door. And he said that the American Airlines Flight 96 indicated that the design changes that had been made had compromised the safety of the entire system, and that it was likely that this would lead to a hull loss during the coming 20 years of the aircraft's normal lifespan. He also pointed towards a pressurization test that had taken place back in 1970, where the first DC-10, Airship 1, had been pressurized during a test, and the forward cargo door had blown up, causing the passenger floor to collapse. Now, this memo is referred to in history as the Applegate memo, and unfortunately it was never acted upon. And the reason why it wasn't acted upon is still a little bit of a debate. But what we do know is that Convair, as a subcontractor, the ones that were responsible for building the door, they were not allowed to contact the FAA themselves. Instead, they should bring any concern they had up to McDonnell Douglas, who would then bring it to the concern of the FAA. But because there were some discussions going on between Convair and McDonnell Douglas about who would bear the responsibility of a complete redesign of the cargo door, this discussion seems like it never took place. After this, there was some serious dispute between McDonnell Douglas and Turkish Airlines about who was actually the responsible party for the crash. But because of the findings, and in part due to the Dan Applegate memo, they decided to settle the lawsuits for, at the time, a record amount of money. The final report came with several safety recommendations because of this accident, including the reiteration of the findings that was made in the American Airlines Flight 96 final report. They also said that particular attention should be put to the cargo door closing and locking and the behavior of flooring in the case of a sudden depressurization of the cargo compartment. They also pointed out that flight controls and wires to the flight controls needed to be protected, as well as the redundancy of those systems. But probably the biggest point they made was that there hadn't been an airworthiness directive issued. And they said that in subsequent cases, when there was any risk of safety being compromised, an airworthiness directive had to be used no matter what the financial implications of that AD might be. And this is something that the industry lives by until this day. After the disaster of Turkish Airlines Flight 981, the latching mechanism for the cargo doors of the DC-10 was completely redesigned. The new design made sure that the mechanism wouldn't stop until the latches were in their perfectly closed position. Also, it connected the locking pins to the vent door, making sure that the only time the vent door would be closed and enable pressurization of the cargo compartment was if the locking pins were in the correct position. Also, the FAA mandated all jumbo jet operators, not only the DC-10 but also the Lockheed 1011 and the Boeing 747, to cut proper vents in between the passenger compartment and the cargo compartment, making sure that a rapid depressurization would not cause a failure of the cabin floor and wouldn't affect any of the flight control cables. In the case of the DC-10, this meant stiffening up and reinforcing the whole floor of the passenger compartment.